Good morning and welcome everyone to this broadcast on behalf of the British Rhinology Society for Juniors. My name's Abby Walker. I'm an ENT registrar in South London. I'm particularly interested in the document that's been published by ENT UK in the last few days, as I'm sure everyone is keeping up to date with the news that is issued on the coronavirus. One of the things that has really hit home is the development of possible anosmia as a clue to the onset of coronavirus. I'm very proud today to be joined by two of the UK's leading rhinologists, Professor Claire Hopkins, Chair of Rhinology at King's College London. I'm sure that all of you are very aware of Claire through ENT circles, but of course we've had to share in the last few days, BBC News, Channel 4 News, the New York Times, everybody has wanted a slice of Claire Hopkins, so really thank you very much for your time today. I've also got Pavol Surda, who's consultant rhinologist at Guy's Hospital, very active academically and clinically, undoubtedly one of the leaders of the next generation of rhinology. I think as well as his clinical assets, I hope some of you may have seen Pavol's other assets, which are on display in another video issued at the ERS in London. Claire, if I may begin with you, thank you very much for issuing that document through the ENT UK. It's been incredibly responsive in how quickly you've been able to gather the data on anosmia. I saw that in the document in Iran and Germany, the estimates run at about 30 to 60% of patients with coronavirus may present with anosmia. And intuitively, what we're seeing on social media, it feels that the UK is mirroring that experience. If you could just go into a bit more detail about the symptom, is this anosmia alone, or is this anosmia plus other nasal symptoms?
So certainly when we started to see peaks in COVID-19 in other countries, it wasn't surprising to find that there were anecdotal reports that a lot of patients known to have COVID-19 were presenting with anosmia. Initially, there was a lot of discussion on closed websites and discussion boards for doctors, such as the American Rhinological Society. But what we all started to report was seeing young, otherwise healthy patients present to ENT at a much greater rate than we would normally expect. And what prompted me to write the statement last week was that I'd seen 3 or 4 patients consecutively with anosmia as the only symptom. And my initial thought was to alert other ENT surgeons to the possibility that this might be COVID-19, because we were seeing them at that point without PPE, without considering that this might be a sign. And, we're all aware of the potential risk to ENT surgeons, and I wanted to get the word out. Now, at that point, there was no peer-reviewed evidence, and indeed that's still the case today, although I'm hoping there will be some papers out in the next few days. There were some reports from newspapers. So a virologist in Germany had interviewed patients in a hospital in Bonn and found that 2 out of 3 patients reported anosmia. There was another report coming out from South Korea, which has now been updated, and they've looked at over 3,000 patients, and they found actually 15% had lost sense of smell. This was in a milder group who were present at home. So it's certainly not present in everybody, but we're seeing an increased incidence. What's been really interesting is since we issued the statement, I've been absolutely inundated with patients saying thank you. Basically, they had been searching the internet to look for a link. They had all recently lost their sense of smell. So quite a few had other mild symptoms, and they had all thought it likely to be a sign of COVID-19 infection, and they hadn't found anything. So when they came across the statement, they got in touch. We've basically asked all of these patients to complete a survey about their symptoms. So we've already got a database of over 1,400 patients.
Wow.
In the first 24 hours, we've managed to analyse over 700 patients. And if we look at the data, about 1 in 6 patients has anosmia as an isolated symptom. Of the remainder, about 10% the anosmia comes on first. In about 30% it comes on at the same time as other symptoms, and in the rest it comes on after. Now, these are patients where we haven't been able to confirm their COVID-19 status because at the moment they're not eligible for testing. But about 5% of the cohort have been tested, and of those, the positive rate is about 78%. So given the sensitivity of the test being in the 70s, it's very likely that they're all positive. I know that there's some data coming out from other hospitals that have looked at the same cohort and should be published in the very near future, where they've been able to confirm with testing with PCR that actually these patients do actually test positive.
That's some really amazing findings, and the speed with which you've managed to gather that data, it's astonishing. Your opening statement, I think, in the ENT UK document was that we are quite used to, as ENT surgeons, seeing post-viral anosmia. But this seems, as you said, a decent proportion are actually almost preceding the onset of other viral symptoms. Is that a feature which you think is quite specific to coronavirus?
I don't know. I mean, we often label patients as post-viral in normal ENT practice when we simply haven't found another underlying cause. And it's not always clear that that dates from a classic upper respiratory tract infection. What seems to be different with these patients is with a typical common cold, patients have nasal congestion, rhinorrhea, and they often attribute their initial loss of sense of smell to simply the nasal blockage. So we as surgeons will perhaps often consider it to be a conductive loss as well. What's quite apparent in these patients is they don't have that nasal obstruction. So they're surprised as well that they can breathe through their nose, but they can't smell. And so it does seem to be very much a sort of a neural effect rather than simple nasal blockage.
I think also what is quite worrisome is that in quite a large proportion of patients, they will have only symptom loss of smell. And so they really can be carriers who will be hidden and not recognized. There is also another part of the population which will develop other symptoms later on. So that in that time, they will also be carriers and risk to society.
That was certainly another reason for issuing the statement, because these were patients who weren't meeting the screening questions to tell them not to come to hospital, so they were still carrying on normal working life. Obviously, now that the population is largely on lockdown, the sort of initial concerns for silent spreading are less severe. But what's still really important is that many of my doctor colleagues are now emailing me to say they've lost their sense of smell. So hospital spread, nosocomial spread, is a real problem. And if healthcare workers remain at work while they're infected, then that's a risk both to the rest of the workforce and to the patients that we look after with other conditions. So it would be certainly a really useful prompt for testing in that group.
And obviously the situation is changing day by day, if not hour by hour. In your personal experience, are you recommending to these physicians that they self-isolate on the basis of anosmia?
Well, that already seems to be what's taking place. It's very difficult because just because a patient is positive, we also don't know if they're infective. And so that urgently needs to be established. And I'm hoping that this statement will help trigger research in that area to actually see if these patients are able to transmit. But until we know that, we want to minimise spread as much as possible. So my hope is that Public Health England, and I know the World Health Organization are looking at the moment, will take it to be one of their criteria. France have already changed their criteria, now have 23 questions to enable them to work out if someone is likely probable COVID-19 or not. In the UK, we're still using data that was brought out at the beginning of February and just relying on cough, shortness of breath and a high fever. When we looked at the patients that are filled in our database, only about 50% of those actually meet the criteria. And many patients have other symptoms such as myalgia, fatigue, diarrhea. So I think in an ideal world, as we get more data, Public Health England and other bodies will be able to change their recommendations to include a broader spectrum of symptoms.
And as with everything in healthcare at the moment, we're having to change enormously our normal standard of care. We're having to move to performing telephone triage of patients who we would normally see in person, so simple conditions such as CRS and allergic rhinitis. And nasal steroids are such a big part of our arsenal for the everyday rhinologist. Should we be changing our usual practice with patients who we think are not at risk of coronavirus in the immediate moment? Should we still be prescribing them with nasal steroids?
So I think nasal steroids, particularly if you use things such as mometazone or fluticasone, the second generation, have very low systemic bioavailability. And I would actually encourage us to continue with our normal practice. For example, we're just coming into the hay fever season, and the risk of people creating aerosol through sneezing and sort of uncontrolled rhinitis is actually quite significant. I think we can reassure patients that it's safe to continue to use nasal steroids, and they should continue to do so if they take them for their normal conditions. What's much more difficult to answer is what we should be doing with oral steroids. So if I had seen someone post-viral with olfactory loss in the first 2 weeks of onset in the past, I would normally have considered prescribing oral steroids. But because of the potential to exacerbate the severity of COVID-19, that becomes much more difficult, particularly when you then have someone that might need them for their nasal polyps or unrelated condition. We're not able to test to exclude COVID-19, and should they subsequently develop COVID-19 whilst on steroids, we just don't know what impact that's going to have. So I think we have to have a careful discussion with patients, weighing up likely risks and benefits. We're certainly starting to reduce our use of oral steroids in inflammatory conditions such as CRS now anyway, because we're more aware of the side effects. And I think this is something to add to the discussion at present.
Pavol, if I can come to you now. The message that we're getting is that we need to collect more data and to analyse that data in a robust fashion. What questions do you think are key for the research to answer?
Now, of course, the survey is really, because of the reduced face-to-face contact, will be the key. We cannot look into the patient's nose and confirm what's happening, but also at the same time, if you have a large cohort enough, we might be able to smear those inaccuracies. And when it comes to the patients, the questions, the most important really when they experience the anosmia, so at the time of onset, so we can see whether there is a trend which mirrors the epidemia. Then also we would like to be interested whether anosmia started or was associated with other symptoms, whether it was the only symptom, whether if there were some symptoms accompanying anosmia, what were they? Because that's really important also for further research and understanding the other symptoms. When it comes to anosmia, important will be whether they've been tested, what was the outcome, whether they had any known contact, and all these questions are really the most important.
Pavol, if anyone who happened to be watching this video either had a patient with anosmia that they thought was related to coronavirus, or indeed happened to have suffered anosmia themselves, how would they be able to participate in research?
I think the best way would be to contact the groups, fifth sense or absent, that will be able to help them and guide them to one or the other research that is running at the moment.
Fantastic.
I think the other thing for patients and for physicians to direct patients to, those groups have really useful information. They will give advice on how to undertake smell training that we know is helpful in post-viral loss. And they will also provide support to patients. From what we see in the news from Italy seems to be mirroring what I'm experiencing in the patients I've seen, that a lot of patients are recovering sense of smell quite early on. There seems to be a good chance of recovery starting within the first 2 weeks, but a small number may likely go on to have persistent loss of sense of smell. And again, directing patients to those support groups will be really important to them moving forward as they adjust and have to live with that. We know that anosmia has quite a significant impact on quality of life, and one very small silver lining that might come out of the COVID-19 epidemic is to actually shine a greater light on those patients and give them more support and make them a better focus of research. The one last thing not to forget is that a very small number of these patients, of course, may not be COVID-19 related at all and may have other conditions. And when normal clinical practice can resume, if anyone has persistent anosmia, I think they should still be investigated in the normal manner. We shouldn't necessarily assume it's all COVID-19 and miss perhaps more important things.
And if I may finish by coming back to you, Claire, and really just to take a step back and take a more philosophical overview of the situation that we're in just now. As scientists, we're used to relying on Cochrane reviews, meta-analysis, systematic reviews, taking time to analyse and build evidence. And instead, we're now at a point where we're having to rapidly assess case reports, case reviews, very small series of patients and take concrete decisions which feel like they have enormous consequences. How does that sit with you as a scientist? And can you see this actually changing the way that we perform evidence reviews in the future?
I was obviously quite conflicted when writing the statement. I could find nothing in the peer-reviewed literature, and I was working very much on a large body of anecdotal evidence, but anecdotal nonetheless. As you know, I'm very heavily involved in Cochrane, and I'm very keen to promote science at the highest level in terms of evidence base. So I am absolutely going against that. I felt the risk to ENT surgeons overruled my sort of scientific heart, and that it was necessarily to protect people. And I think we have to adjust to the needs of this situation. You know, this is to protect life, to protect each other. But I think at the end of it, we'll have time to reflect and then review all the evidence in a more timely and a more scientific manner. What's been really fantastic to come out of this is the international collaboration. There have been a number of groups set up where people have very freely shared information before publication without any concern for IP or their own sort of career promotion, and that's been really important. You know, people want to work together, they want to get information out quickly and get it to the right people, and that's been very effective.
I'd like to thank you both so much for your time. This has been enormously informative for myself, and I hope that we can share this as widely as possible. Thank you again for your time. Stay safe, and we'll stay in contact. Bye-bye.